Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou and ni hao. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you here again today at my fourth China Business Summit. Can I begin by acknowledging, as I always do, Fran, for your leadership in this space and for an introduction which adds just a little bit of expectation to my speech this morning. Can I also acknowledge Michael Barnett, co-chair, and also in the room today, past Prime Ministers, Helen Clark and Sir John Key, and Madam Wu, and distinguished guests, including colleagues, the Honourable Damien O'Connor, Minister for Trade and Export Growth, my colleague MP Nazi Chen, and I also see that we are joined by the Honourable Winston Peters here today as well. I acknowledge each of you. As ever, I'm pleased to see such a range of speakers and participants. This reflects the continuing breadth of engagement between New Zealand and China. I hardly need to tell this audience that it's been yet another year of both change and disruption. But there has, of course, been progress and also cause for optimism too. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about both. Let me first make some comments about the past year for us as a country and also in our relationship with China. Some of you will remember that when we last spoke, I wanted to leave you with three key messages. Today I want to build on those in a more substantive way, but just to recap on those 3 points. First, that China's geostrategic relevance is a reality that no country can ignore. Second, that New Zealand and China have very different perspectives on some issues, and we will need to work hard to manage those differences effectively. And third, that there continue to be opportunities for New Zealand and China to work together, particularly in international trade, environment and climate change, and of course in our response to the global pandemic. I'm also going to add a fourth takeaway point to the list this year, but I'm going to keep you waiting and add that a little later on. Let me start though by acknowledging that New Zealand's relationship with China is one of our most significant, and again, not something I need to tell this particular audience. Our comprehensive strategic partnership continues to provide a strong foundation for that relationship, and we remain committed to our One China policy. Minister Mahuta spoke with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi soon after she took office. Minister O'Connor has also spoken with his Chinese counterpart and can tell you a little bit more about that dialogue later this morning. And just a couple of weeks ago, I gave a presentation remotely, of course, at the invitation of the Chinese government at the opening plenary of China's annual Bao Forum hosted by President Xi Jinping. Trade in goods between our two countries has remained resilient despite the challenges of COVID. While some of our goods exports to China declined in the early months of the pandemic last year, overall, our exports have remained strong. Some exports to China, for example, dairy, honey and kiwi fruit, many of the representatives from those industries here today, increased in value in 2020 on the previous year despite COVID. Our two-way trade flows are now well in excess of $30 billion per year. New Zealand food exports remain among the safest and purest in the world and in great demand, and we are rightly proud of that. And despite the restrictions placed upon us all by COVID-19, exchanges in agriculture, business and climate change remain strong. The successful signing of our FTA upgrade in January will bring benefit on both sides. For New Zealand, it provides new commitments on services markets in China, tariff elimination on wood and paper products, improvements in customs procedures, and new chapters on e-commerce and the environment. Minister O'Connor will say more on this shortly, but what I will say is that the upgrade ensures that the rules underpinning our bilateral trade are responsive to changing patterns of commerce, up to date and also fit for purpose. We also welcome the signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership with China's ratification last month. New Zealand is well advanced in our domestic ratification process, and we look forward to the early entry into force of both of these important agreements. And beyond this, we are working to increase New Zealand's long-term resilience and gain better access for New Zealand companies to a diverse range of markets and economic opportunities. I acknowledge here once again the difficulties that COVID has brought, though, for key sectors for New Zealand, such as education and tourism industries. We are keeping in touch with China on our borders and also our travel settings. Our travel bubble with Australia, though, is a first positive and practical step. The New Zealand border is likely to continue to be restricted for some time yet as the world continues to deal with COVID, but we will continue to find innovative ways to engage nonetheless. But while COVID-19 has prevented many of the people-to-people connections that would normally have taken place and that are so important for New Zealand and China, links still remain strong. I welcome the work on both sides to support greater cultural awareness and understanding, just by way of example. In a year where Chinese New Year events were affected in many places around the world because of COVID, it was particularly special to be able to participate once again in lively celebrations here in New Zealand. And last month, Māori and Chinese community leaders gathered to bless a memorial to the SS Ventnor, which sank off the coast of the Hokianga Harbour in 1902 while carrying the remains of 499 Chinese gold miners back to their homeland. This once again highlights our long history together and the importance both countries place on that. We need to do all we can to maintain and to grow our people-to-people links and to improve understanding and connection. These exchanges I consider to be core to our relationship. As Minister Mahuta observed in her speech to the New Zealand-China Council, different perspectives can underpin cultural exchange and also learning. But some differences challenge New Zealand's interests and values. With that in mind, earlier I mentioned that I wanted to add a fourth takeaway point this morning, and that is that managing the relationship is not always going to be easy, and there can be no guarantees. What do I mean by this? Given our two countries' different histories, different worldviews, and different political and legal systems, New Zealand and China are going to take different perspectives on important issues. We will continue to work these through in a consistent manner, as we have always done. But as Minister Mahuta said last month, we need to acknowledge that there are some things on which China and New Zealand do not, cannot, and will not agree. This need not derail our relationship. It is simply a reality. New Zealand is an open, pluralistic democracy with a focus on transparency and the rule of law. We take a principles-based approach to our foreign policy, and we make our decisions independently, informed by our own assessment of New Zealand's interests and values. We've shown this quite clearly over the past year by deliberately working through when we make public statements on issues of concern and with whom. New Zealanders expect their government to take a principled stance on issues, particularly where our values are at stake. I know this because I hear that directly from them. The government will continue to act in a way that serves our interests, reflects our values, and maintains our independent foreign policy, something that has been jealously guarded over many, many decades. In the past year, for example, though, we chose to raise some issues with China in private, but alongside this, we also chose to make public statements with a significant number of other countries and multilateral bodies, such as the Human Rights Council. And at other times, we've chosen to partner with Australia, the UK, the US, and other countries that share our views and values. And sometimes we spoke out alone. We've commented publicly about our grave concerns regarding the human rights situation of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And I've raised these concerns with senior Chinese leaders on a number of occasions, including with the Guangdong Party Secretary in September 2018, and then with China's leaders when I visited in 2019. You'll know that, as a government, we've also spoken out about continued negative developments with regard to the rights, freedoms and autonomy of the people of Hong Kong. Alongside areas of cooperation that I mentioned earlier, areas where we disagree form part of a comprehensive relationship. Areas of difference need not define a relationship, but equally, they are part and parcel of New Zealand staying true to who we are as a nation. And it will not have escaped the attention of anyone here that as China's role in the world grows and changes, the differences between our systems and the interests and values that shape those systems are becoming harder to reconcile. This is a challenge that we and many other countries across the Indo-Pacific region, but also in Europe and other regions, are also grappling with. As a significant power, the way that China treats its partners is important for us, and we will continue to promote the things that we believe in and support the rules-based system that underpins our collective well-being. As I said in my recent remarks in the Bow Forum for Asia, New Zealand is a strong supporter of the rules, norms, and international framework that governs global affairs. We are active members of the WTO, WHO, the bodies upholding the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, international climate change arrangements, and international human rights treaties, among others. Rules, norms, and institutions provide the basis for our prosperity and our security, and they facilitate cooperation on global issues that can be only solved collectively. I'd again echo the words of Minister Mahusha. We hope that China too sees in its own core interests to act in the world in ways that are consistent with its responsibilities as a growing power, including as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Let me turn now to a key economic forum in which New Zealand and China have a long history of collaboration, and this is going to be a short, shameless period of propaganda. As the host of APEC in 2021, New Zealand has a unique opportunity as the chair to play a role in shaping the future of the Asia Pacific. In November last year, I joined APEC leaders, including President Xi, to set out a vision that will guide the APEC region over the next 20 years. The Putrajaya vision, we agreed, sets out the aspiration of an open, dynamic, and peaceful Asia-Pacific community by 2040. And now, as APEC host, New Zealand holds the pen on shaping a plan to deliver on this vision. It's a big responsibility and one that we are embracing. How we collectively respond to the challenges faced by the APEC region today will be felt for generations to come. Of course, the greatest challenge at present is the impact of COVID-19 on the region's people and on the region's economy. New Zealand is working with the 20 other APEC economies, including China, to ensure that our economic responses to COVID-19 in areas like trade and economic policy are pulling in the same direction. In particular, we want the recovery to be sustainable and equitable, harnessing digital technologies, decarbonising our economies, ensuring that the recovery is for all, including women, small business, and Indigenous and ethnic communities. Inspired by the Māori proverb, Haumea huie tae ki e, our aspiration for APEC in 2021 is to join together, to reignite growth and plan for a long-lasting economic recovery, to work together for the collective good of the region, and to grow together to foster prosperity and well-being that is sustainable and inclusive. We look forward to working closely with China and our other APEC partners to realise this vision, and I look forward to my discussions with President Xi in APEC later this year. And looking ahead a little further, next year will be the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between New Zealand and China. Of course, relations between the peoples of our two countries stretch back much further in history, but 50 years of official recognition and cooperation is an achievement I know we'll all want to celebrate. We've done a lot and we've come a long way together. Maintaining contact and promoting understanding between our two countries and peoples remains a crucial foundation of our relationship. The pandemic continues around the world, but we have seen that this does not stop us from working, trading, and indeed talking together. This summit is an excellent example of just that, and I wish everyone here all the best for the rest of today's activities. Your hard work and connections form the backbone of this relationship, and it is the government's job to support you wherever we can. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Before I open the discussion with just a few questions of my own for the Prime Minister, but I would like to remind you all we have Slido this is your opportunity to put your questions to the Prime Minister. And if you would just start on that, that would be terrific. So we actually have some here in a moment. Prime Minister, you talked about managing the relationship won't always be easy, and there won't be necessarily no guarantees. Can you expand what you mean by that?
Yeah, as I hope, forgive me, just adjust the volume here. I think as you will have picked up in my speech, and this has been a thing for us over the past 4 years, just an acknowledgement that our relationship with China is a significant one, an important one to us. But so too is the importance of our independent foreign policy. And that's something that New Zealand's been very consistent around. And whilst we've been consistent, there are changes in the geostrategic role that China plays in our region. And some of those changes will mean that we will see some of those differences come to the fore. That means that we, whilst being consistent, ultimately the relationship is something that needs to be jointly navigated between the two of us as nations. And whilst I can tell you absolutely the way that we will respond to issues because we're consistent, you will naturally also anticipate our response to issues. But ultimately, in a two-way relationship, it will be for China to determine then how they engage with us when we raise issues of concern and so on.
This suggests a valuable role for diplomacy in this era.
Indeed. And look, again, I would say that one of, I think, the strengths of New Zealand's approach has been that we are consistent, we're predictable. We will raise issues in private, we will raise issues to reinforce those private conversations in public as well. We will use particularly international institutions, those multilateral forums to raise concerns because we see those as an appropriate place to do so, the Human Rights Council being an example. And sometimes from time to time we'll make statements on our own also, but we are in all of that very predictable. I think it's not hard to see where New Zealand will position itself, be it on issues of the Uyghur people or on Hong Kong, or indeed on issues around climate and environment. But again, that predictability, whilst I can give guarantees around that, ultimately it is a two-way relationship.
You mentioned APEC, which we're all looking forward to very much. When you go to APEC, and I've traipsed around to a few of those over the decades, there's always various political leaders who play a determining role there. They're part of the magic of the place. What will you expect from President Xi? What do you want his contribution to be this year?
Well, look, firstly, I'd say the dynamic of APEC will be very, very different, just for the sake of there being some level of planning able to be put in place. We decided that we would run a virtual event. Some have asked, given it's later on in the year, why not wait until a few months prior to make the decision as to whether or not you have a leaders face-to-face meeting? Unfortunately, that doesn't take into account the fact that there's a large number of events that take place in the lead up to APEC. Equally, there are a large number of people that do need to come in support of the APEC program. We wanted to give certainty, and it just wasn't logistically possible to do that if we were going to hang in the balance whether we'd have a face-to-face event. So one of the challenges for us will be, how do we create that dynamic environment with good engagement, leaders meetings, which in my experience, actually APEC is quite good at not creating set pieces, which are quite common in some other forums. Because we have a closed session with the leaders meetings, you don't just necessarily have leaders reading from script, which is common in other forums. So the challenge for us will be, how do we move away to that dynamic engagement, ensure we get that dynamic engagement in a virtual environment. By doing so, I hope we create an environment where President Xi and others will be able to engage on some of those significant priorities we have. I imagine that the ongoing impacts of the pandemic will be writ large, but I don't want that to detract from some practical conversations around challenges like climate. We've seen ambitious targets set by China. They have a significant role to play, not only as leaders in manufacturing and technology around our response to climate change, but also in regard to their own domestic goals. We'd like to see commitments, for instance, to remove fossil fuel subsidies. We'd like to see trade barriers removed for climate-related goods and services. And these are the kinds of conversations I really want to see all leaders engage in.
Thank you. First question from the floor, from Anonymous, voted up high. Any prospects for a travel bubble with China?
Well, you'll see that we're moving through different arrangements as we speak, starting with those where, of course, really close economic relationship and very special relationship to us. Australia, similar strategy on COVID. Today I'll be announcing dates for similar arrangements for the Cook Islands. Once the likes of Niue, another realm country of New Zealand, is ready, from them it's on their side, we'll likely announce prospects there. And then we'll look beyond. You know, part of our strategy has to be, though, as we transition to an environment where we've used the borders as our armour and we move to individuals being vaccinated as being our armour, how do we do that safely whilst maintaining a strategy of just ensuring we don't have outbreaks within New Zealand? So that's probably some way off, but we are thinking very carefully around how we reconnect people to people over the coming year.
Thank you. The next one, Prime Minister, you've rejected...
Another anonymous, I know.
Yeah, no, that's typical, I'm afraid. Anyway, you've rejected a suggestion that New Zealand's statements on Five Eyes in China have created a strain with the United States. Why do you say that?
Because it's true. That would be my simple answer. And look, that's a relationship that's very, and intelligence and security arrangements, very important to us. I think, you know, the point that's really being missed there is simply, as I reiterated in the speech, New Zealand has always and will always make its own decisions as to various platforms that it uses to raise issues. And that's one that we have and will continue to use, but there'll be other forums where sometimes we'll speak out on our own. We've got past examples where we've spoken out with Australia, and even recently where we've spoken out via the ILO with different nations. So for me, that's not particularly a change in position, and I don't believe it's being seen as such by others.
Yeah, another good question. Will the government risk trade punishment from China, as like Australia, to uphold values?
The thing that I would say to that is that, you know, well, these need to be seen as issues in and of themselves. You know, when we're coming to make a decision around whether we speak on an issue of concern to us, that needs to be thought through on its merits on its own. We need to ask ourselves the question, is this something that confronts our values as a nation? And what's the best way for us to convey those concerns? And that needs to be the consideration. It would be of concern to anyone in New Zealand, I think, if the consideration was, do we speak on this or are we too worried about economic impacts? And so that's how we consider our decisions around those issues, and that's as it should be. And I'd like to think that's as it has been in New Zealand for many years.
Yeah. Now, I did see one from Stephen Jacoby, which has dropped off. Stephen, would you like to place that question yourself from the audience?
Not anonymous.
I'm well used to this forum.
I'm anonymous from Tamaki Makaurau. Prime Minister, how can New Zealand and China cooperate on climate change?
A great question. You know, actually, one of the points that I've been making is that even over the past year, there's been a couple of areas in which New Zealand and China has kept up its dialogue. And one has been discussions around emissions trading, technical discussions around emissions trading, and also the other has been small business regulation, where New Zealand, as one of the easiest countries in the world to do business, is an area where we have been sharing, you know, our experiences with our counterparts in China. Specifically on climate change, ways in which we could work together. New Zealand has been, and I mentioned these very briefly, but this is where I think we could see a significant difference made. We do need large economies to take a very strong stand on subsidies for fossil fuels. Because in doing so, if we diverted the amount of money that goes into subsidies for fossil fuels, in which honestly I think risks stranded assets amongst many other issues going into the future, if we saw a transfer of that investment into climate-related technologies and investment, actually the amount would be 5 times over what is currently needed for climate finance. And so big economies taking a position on those issues would make a material difference. And the second area, we have championed a free trade agreement which New Zealand, Norway, Costa Rica, Fiji, amongst others, have signed up to around free trade for climate-related goods and services. Having larger economies start thinking about those tools would just add such weight to the work that we've been trying to champion as well. There's a couple of little examples. The others I'd say are all around actually business-to-business engagement. What can we do to share new technologies, share our learnings, and really increase business engagement around climate-related tech.
A sectoral question. Obviously, education has had a tough time since COVID. So, question on when do you plan to allow Chinese students to re-enter New Zealand to support educational institutions in their recovery?
Yeah, and this has been something that Minister Hipkins, or it's actually in this case been quite helpful that he holds both the COVID-19 recovery portfolio and the education portfolio, because he has a real sense of where the possibility practically lies for us to re-engage. I think the first steps will be engagement through a quarantine allocation approach. And that's something that he's been thinking and working actively on. What we have to balance that against, of course, and he'd be looking to do that in low-risk international education markets as a starting point. But what we have to balance that against is the ongoing demand for places in our managed isolation facilities for critical workers. The RSC workforce, for instance, and horticulture have particular calls on some of that low-risk space within MIQ. And so that's some of the practical issues we're working through. So whilst I don't have a specific date, it is something that he is working on as we speak.
And another anonymous. Last year you described the relationship with China as in good shape. Where are we now? Better, same or worse?
I think, these judgments will be, both relative and subjective. I still consider it to be a strong relationship, but its strength in the future will be determined not by whether or not we have issues of concern with one another, because that's a given. It's how we navigate those issues of concern. And of course, from New Zealand's perspective, it would be our hope that those issues of concern don't define our relationship, that we are able to speak freely and frankly with one another on where we disagree, because that is inevitable, but we are still able to keep that strength and that maturity there. So that will be our ongoing goal.
Prime Minister, China is our biggest trading relationship. In the past, you had hoped to take a bunch of business people up to China. Are you hoping to do that next year or this year? This year might seem ambitious, but...
China has been one of the places that I've talked about being a priority when we're in the space to be able to move around a little bit more. Alongside that, though, I've also mentioned those markets where we are actively in negotiations and working to establish free trade agreements. So what I would put alongside China would also be, of course, Europe, as we work through our FTA negotiations with the EU, and also, critically, the UK, where we are making progress on those arrangements. So I'd say those would be our other priorities, particularly on behalf of our exporters.
Yeah, just staying on that topic, I mean, if you look at dairy, for instance, we have got a very good deal with China. It's a phase out of tariffs. Do you expect really Europe or UK to give us anything within cooey of that?
We do have there's a very high standard set in our FTA with China, undoubtedly. One of the, of course, arguments, and you'll hear Minister O'Connor probably speak to this a little bit as well, we seek in every arrangement a very high quality deal, and that's not only trying to improve our market access. You never want to stay in a static arrangement, so improving our market access, but at the same time trying to seek some competitive advantage by way of the fact that we actually do things differently in New Zealand. The way that we produce our products in an environmentally sustainable way, how can we use that to improve our market access as well? So our argument to the likes of the EU has been, will you consider your obligations under the Paris Agreement and, of course, your goals to reduce emissions? You take them very seriously. Well, how can they be acknowledged as well in your trade agreements? Because on that score, we are the only country in the world who are currently looking to have a comprehensive pricing mechanism for emissions that include emissions from our agricultural sector. And one of the reasons we've done that is not only our obligations, but actually to try and set ourselves apart and give us that ongoing advantage by the way that we produce our goods and try and get that embedded in our free trade agreements as well.
We have a large Chinese audience today, and one of the questions that has come up is, we've just had an Asian Life Matters protest earlier in April, and what's your perspective on Asian safety in New Zealand right now?
It's not as good as it should be. And, you know, one of the things, many things that was devastating in the ongoing response to COVID was hearing the stories of the discrimination that people experienced, particularly in the early days of the pandemic. And for me, that was another window into the discrimination that members of our Asian community here in New Zealand experience. And, you know, for the vast majority of New Zealanders, that sits completely counter to what we consider ourselves to be as a nation. We are not perfect in this regard, and we need to keep making sure that we're working hard to improve the safety, the sense of safety, and the treatment in all regards of all members of our Asian community.
What do you see the key factors to consider when opening the board with China? And this is both countries having done a pretty good job on COVID, controlling COVID.
Yes, similar criteria that we've taken to date. You know, we will be looking for ways to restart engagement but maintain the principle of our elimination strategy, which is ultimately to protect the health and well-being of New Zealanders and those resident here. And so for every arrangement, that has been the judgment that we've taken. Can we safely manage this reopening whilst keeping that principle? The really interesting thing, so that will be our given over the next year. If I may, Fran, just speak very briefly to the strategy over 2021. I mentioned very briefly that principle of our border and the role that is played. Because we haven't had universal access to a vaccine yet, we've needed to protect our people by using the border as our front line. Now, as we roll out the vaccine, that gives us the opportunity for that protection to move to individual armour. But in order for that individual armour to work, we need a high proportion of the population to have it, because otherwise we still risk chains of transmission and outbreaks, which we've been working to avoid so comprehensively. So that is our known. We have enough research and evidence to suggest that the efficacy of the vaccine we're using, if it reaches enough people in New Zealand, and it needs to be evenly spread, it can't be just a generic, percentage. If you have, say, 90% of Wellington vaccinated, but only 60% of, say, South Auckland, you will still have outbreaks. So we need good even spread of that vaccine. That's the thing we know we need to work towards, and we've set the goal of doing that across the course of this year. There are then a couple of variables which only research and evidence is going to tell us will be possible. But the variable of whether or not, for instance, you have a system where people have called it vaccine passports, where you have someone who's vaccinated, the question of whether or not they'll be able to enter New Zealand without, whilst we still are waiting to vaccinate our population, without going into MIQ, that's really going to come down to the ongoing data around whether or not a vaccinated person still can pass COVID-19 on to others. The interesting thing is, of course, many countries, the reason it's hard to get research on this is many countries, once they've vaccinated their people, aren't continuing to test them. We are, because our frontline workers are vaccinated and we're continuing to test them, so we potentially might be able to contribute to the research in this space. We've had a couple of individuals who have had COVID, having been immunised. Now, the great thing is, as the vaccine has always described itself, 95% of people, once vaccinated, will not have symptomatic infections. So they're much less likely to get very sick and much less likely, of course, to pass away. But we are still waiting on a bit more of a body of evidence, Fran, around whether or not vaccine passports, while we're not all vaccinated ourselves, are going to be in line with our ongoing strategy to prevent outbreaks in New Zealand. So it's a little bit of a watch this space. We're keeping an open mind. But there's a bit of work to be done, and the international community is doing it as well, so that we have a system that verifies vaccination passports through the ETA system that we already have.
I'll just have one final question from the floor, and it's from Frankie Wong from BNZ. Last year, independence was the main focus for you. How can we remain independent in terms of our trade policy with China when it's our biggest trading partner?
Yeah, and Frankie, I hope that you will have got a sense of that from my comments. I don't think anyone in New Zealand would want us to feel that our economic relationship constrains us from a values-based relationship. And so we will, navigate as we always have, sticking to that independent foreign policy position we have always had. People often ask me the question, which lane are we choosing to swim in? We swim in New Zealand's lane, and we always have. And we, I find myself or consider myself to be a guardian of that for the time that I'm in office, in the same way that Helen Clark was a guardian of that independence and Sir John Key was a guardian of that independence. Because we have a very proud history of that. We've stood up against a number of different countries that we consider to be close to when it matters to us, and we will continue to do so. So in that regard, I don't believe our position has changed one iota.
On that point, we'll leave it. Thank you so much, for Prime Minister, for giving you your time today and our time today. It's been absolutely wonderful. It's been very frank. You've laid it out there, and there's a lot for us to dwell on during today. Thank you.